Good evening and welcome. To those of you who are not familiar with Beit Terezin, I am Tammy Kinberg, General Director of Beit Terezin, otherwise known as Beit Terezinstadt in English. For those of you who are joining us for the first time and are not familiar with Beit Terezin, we are located on Kibbutz Givat Chaim Ichud in the center of Israel. Our organization was established by survivors of Ghetto Theresienstadt to commemorate those who perished and to create a place that will act as a bridge connecting the victims, survivors, and future generations. Our campus consists of a small museum, exhibition halls, an archive that houses a unique collection of artwork created in the ghetto, and close to 10,000 artifacts and documents. An educational center that serves thousands of students, teachers, researchers, Israeli soldiers, and visitors from Israel and abroad. Due to the COVID pandemic, we had to switch to working online, and this has made it easier to share our activities with people all over the world. So today we have the honor of hosting a great friend and supporter of Beit Terezin, Randy Schenberg, who will speak about the woman in gold. Randy, thank you for joining us, and the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Tammy. I'm here in the mountains in California, and it's amazing that we all get to get together this way. As Tammy said, I've been a long time supporter of Beit Theresienstadt, interested, of course, because my great-grandfather was deported to Theresienstadt and spent, unfortunately, 2 months there before being deported to Treblinka. But this story today is going to be about Maria Altman, who was a very close family friend of my family, and her husband Fritz and my mother's father, Eric Zeisel, knew each other already in Vienna, and the family sort of reconnected in Los Angeles. So I'll tell a little bit more about that as we get into the story, but this is really the story of Maria Altman and how I helped her recover these fabulous Klimt paintings that belonged to her uncle. So let's get right into it. Let's hope this sharing works, and I'm gonna click, there we go. Okay, so here's Maria as I knew her as an adult, although she knew me since, I used to joke, she knew me since my mother was in diapers, which is true, but she knew me my whole life. But at the time I was working with her, this is what she looked like. She was elderly, and this is her outside of her home. She had a modest home in Los Angeles and a reproduction of the portrait of her aunt, Adela Bloch-Bauer. So this is their story. The picture in the lower left corner is one I found in my grandmother's things. These are Maria's parents, Gustav and Teresa Bloch-Bauer. And there were 2 boys named Bloch who married 2 girls named Bauer. So the older siblings were Gustav and Teresa, those are the older ones, and their younger brother and younger sister also married. That's Ferdinand and Adela Bloch-Bauer, the aunt and uncle of Maria. So it was sort of like a double aunt. Adela Bloch-Bauer was her mother's sister, but also the wife of her father's brother, if everybody's following that. Gustav and Teresa, the older pair, had 5 children. And Maria was the baby of the family, what you might call an accident baby. Her next older sibling was her sister Louisa, who was 8 years older. And then she had 3 even older brothers. So she was very much the baby of the family. And of course, at the end, she was the only one left who was able to pursue the paintings when that became a possibility. Gustav was the lawyer of the family. And Ferdinand, his younger brother, ran a sugar company. They were from Bohemia originally. And Ferdinand became the president of something called the Austrian Sugar Industry Corporation, which pretty much monopolized sugar production. For all of us who are on this call, most of us have family from there. We understand how important sugar is to the diet there. When I started on the case and found that out, I didn't understand, because in California, of course, the sugar comes from sugar cane in Hawaii and things like that. So how could you make sugar in Central Europe? And the answer is through sugar beets. So they grew sugar beets and developed a manufacturing process, which was very successful. Ferdinand and Adela, unfortunately, could not have children. Adela, I think, had several stillborn babies, very sad. And I like to think, sort of as a result, they collected a lot of artwork. So here's really a little bit of a picture of how they lived. This is their home in Vienna, which is, if you know where the State Opera is, on the famous ring, the big boulevard that was made from the old city walls in Vienna. This is 1 block away from that. So it's 1 block outside of the ring. You make a right turn and there you are at the Elisabethstrasse, where Ferdinand and Adela lived. He ran the sugar corporation out of this building and then lived on one of the floors. And they had a beautiful art collection. Ferdinand, I think, was older and more conservative, and he liked what are called Biedermeier style paintings. So 19th century Austrian artists were very popular, of course, at that time, not so well known, but people like Ferdinand Waldmüller or Rudolf von Alt. They, of course, had a Rodin sculpture. They had the largest collection of antique Austrian porcelain in the world, 300 settings like this. So each one of these cups and saucers is a single setting. Can you imagine having 300 of these beautiful things in your home? Of course, if you're rich, in Vienna, as the Bloch-Bauers were, you have to have a nice little summer house. So this is their summer house just north of Prague, where the Blochs were from. They were from Mlada Boleslav, or Jungbunzlau in German. And this is nearby a castle that Ferdinand purchased. And this is actually a postcard that Maria sent from the castle with a picture on it in 1932. Just as one sort of interesting side story, this castle was taken over by the Nazis when they annexed Czechoslovakia in 1939, and was used as the residence for what they called the Reichsprotector of Bohemian Moravia, which was the top Nazi official in that area. First, it was Konstantin von Neurath, and then he was replaced by Reinhard Heydrich, who I'm sure the people on this call know. Usually have to explain who Reinhard Heydrich is, but for anybody who doesn't know, he is the architect of the final solution. He is the one that held the infamous Wannsee Conference in Berlin, which plotted the extermination of all of the Jews of Europe. He was living in Ferdinand and Adela's summer home, this castle, at that time. He went up to Berlin for the conference and then came back, and several weeks later he was assassinated by Czech partisans while driving into Prague. That led the Nazis to massacre almost an entire town called Lidice in Bohemia, where they rounded up all the men, women, and children and sent them all to camps, and pretty much everybody was killed. Not necessarily Jewish, but the whole town. So it's a famous episode, so famous actually that during the war they made 2 films about this assassination of Heydrich, one of which the music was written by my mother's father, Eric Zeisel. A small coincidence there. Okay, so let's go back to the main story. I usually explain, actually, before I get to Klimt, for those of you who don't know, how this Bloch-Bauer family sort of came to be in the position that they were, so wealthy. So for people who aren't familiar, Jews were not given full civil rights in Austria-Hungary until 1867. And at that time, Austria-Hungary was an enormous empire. It encompassed what is today, I think, 12 or 13 different countries. And Jews were, in general, not allowed to live where they wanted or work in the professions that they wanted until after that 1867 time period, at which time a lot of them flooded into the capital city of Vienna. And the Blochs and Bauers are an example of 2 families who did that. And of course, this coincided with the end of the Industrial Revolution in that part of the world. And so there were just tremendous economic opportunities. And so some families, the Blochs in sugar, the Bauers in banking and railroads, made an enormous fortune at that time. Of course, not all Jewish families who came into Vienna prospered in that way. My family was certainly very poor for the most part, but some of the families became fabulously wealthy, and the Blochs and Bauers were 2 of those families. So I'd just like to explain the background a little bit. At the time of the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, around 1900, the most famous and sought after artist in Vienna was Gustav Klimt. He had started out as an academic painter, really the finest draftsman of his generation. He received a number of important commissions from the government. Remember, they're building all of these big buildings on the ring at that time, again, center of this enormous empire. So he got a lot of commissions, but he started developing a little bit of more modern style, a little more impressionist, and fell out of favor with the academy. He was kicked out and formed something called the Secession, where he and some friends seceded from the academy. They formed their own sort of art group. Klimt then got tired of his friends of the Secession and went out on his own and became the most successful and expensive artist of his time in Vienna until his early death in 1918 during the flu epidemic. He died of the flu, the Spanish flu, at that time, very tragically. You see him, a picture of him here. He supposedly painted in this long smock with nothing on underneath, and had lots of nude models around all the time, had quite a reputation. When he died in 1918, there were, I think, 17 or 18 illegitimate children who claimed that he was the father. He had never married and never had any legitimate kids, but there were a lot of little Klimts wandering around at that time. Anyway, Ferdinand commissioned Klimt to paint a portrait of his young bride, Adela. Adela was probably the one that was more interested in Klimt. She was a much more modern person, apparently, than Ferdinand, a real intellectual. And Maria always said that Adela, in another era, she probably would have studied law. She would have been a politician or a lawyer or a professor of some sort. She was very, very intelligent and intellectual. But in those days, as the young bride of a head of a sugar company, she formed a salon and invited artists and intellectuals to meet in her home and discuss the issues of the day. So Klimt painted hundreds of these sketches over a 3-year period, and finally finished the famous gold portrait of Adela Bloch-Bauer, his first portrait of Adela, in 1907. It's made with this gold mosaic, which was a style that Klimt picked up after a trip to Ravenna in Italy, where they have old Roman mosaics. And he decided to replicate that. There are, I think, 3 or 4 paintings done in this style. Maybe the more famous one is the painting The Kiss, but the gold portrait of Adela Bloch-Bauer is equally famous, I think, and probably the best preserved of those paintings. I heard The Kiss is not as well preserved. So Klimt went on then to do a second portrait of Adela in 1912. It's a much different style. You can see Japanese figurines in the background. He had moved on to a different technique. And Maria told me also there were rumors at the time of the first portrait that, because of Klimt's reputation, that maybe Adela and Klimt had sort of an affair or something like that. And Maria said she even asked her mother, Adela's older sister, if that were true. And she said her mother denied it. And then Maria added, well, she would have said that anyway, even if it was true. But the art historians say that whatever heat was between them in 1907 clearly was off in 1912. It's a much more cool and reserved portrait of Adela. And this is, Adela really, I think, is the only person with 2 full-length portraits by Klimt. So it's really a remarkable thing. The Bloch-Bauers collected several other paintings by Klimt. They had this beechwood or birch trees, depending on which tree you look at, landscape. They had this beautiful apple tree, which may have been painted when Klimt was a guest of theirs at their summer home outside of Prague, where he visited. They have this slightly unfinished landscape on a lake, Attersee in Austria. You can see in the lower right-hand corner, it's slightly unfinished. So the thinking is that they purchased this after Klimt died in 1918 from his estate. They also had the third of 4 pictures that Klimt did on Lake Atter in Austria, this beautiful Schlosskammer on Attersee number 3. So initially they had the 2 portraits of Adela and the 4 landscapes. Adela, unfortunately, died very young in 1925. This is before the invention of penicillin. She developed, I think, meningitis or encephalitis, and died relatively quickly. And she had drafted a very short will after the death of her parents in 1923, probably helped by Maria's father, who was the lawyer of the family. He's named as an executor in the will. And it's just 4 handwritten pages. These are 2 of the 4 pages. And in the lower right-hand corner of the second page on this scan, you can see the important paragraph here. Before we get to that, though, Adela, as I mentioned, she was a very intellectual, a very progressive person. You might call her a socialist socialite, because of course she was very wealthy, but she was a real supporter of the new socialist government in Austria that came to power after World War I. And you can see in her will, she makes various bequests to the Orphan Society and the Workers' Society and things like that. And at the bottom of this second page, she says, "My 2 portraits and the 4 landscapes of Gustav Klimt, bitte ich meine Ehegatten." That means I ask, please, that my husband give these after his death to the Austrian State Gallery. And in the same sentence, she also asks him to give their library that is in Vienna and also in their castle outside of Prague to the Vienna People's and Workers' Library. So again, she's asking her husband after his death to give her 2 portraits and the 4 landscapes of Gustav Klimt to the Austrian Gallery. Now, she died, as I said, in 1925. She was only 43 years old. And in the proceedings in court after she died, which were conducted by Maria's father, Gustav, he filed a document which said interesting things about this paragraph in particular. He said that the deceased, Adela, makes several bequests which do not have the binding character of a testament. Nevertheless, he said, her husband Ferdinand promised to fulfill her wishes. And then he added, it should be noted that the Klimt paintings were not her property, but his property. So let me break that down because it becomes important. So what did Gustav mean when he said she makes certain requests which do not have the binding character of a testament? Well, that refers to an issue in inheritance law that is an issue of interpretation. The problem when you're interpreting a will is that the person who wrote it is dead. So you can't ask, what did you mean by this? And there are times in people's will where they make requests which are not meant to be binding. The example I like to give is, let's say I had a dog and I wrote in my will, my dear wife, please after I'm gone, take care of the dog. And I die and she says, oh, thank goodness, I hate that dog, out of the house, right? I never want to see it again. That's probably okay, even though I said, please take care of the dog. It was just a request to her. On the other hand, if I said in my will, in order to receive $1 from my estate, you must agree to take care of our dog in the manner to which it's become accustomed until its dying day, right? If I said you have to do it as a condition, right? That would be a requirement. That's not an obligation that you can give up. So the language in American jurisprudence, it's called precatory language, meaning language that is not intended to be binding. And it's interesting that in the family, when Adela died, this language in her will was not considered binding. I should add that on a later page in the will, in the event that Ferdinand had died first, and Maria's family, her parents were the heirs, in that case, she used different language, and she says, it's a Verpflichtung, which is an obligation, right? I obligate you to give these paintings to the gallery. So in this case, if Adela died first, it was really up to Ferdinand what to do. The second sentence said, though, that Ferdinand promised to fulfill her wishes. So you might ask, what is the legal effect of a promise like this? And then he added that the paintings were not her property, but were his property. So what does that mean? Adela had property. She had inherited from her father, the banker, quite a lot. She owned half of the home in Vienna, for example. But for whatever reason, under the regime that they had at that time, it was not what we call in California community property. In other words, the husband and wife don't own everything together. They had a separate property regime. And for whatever reason, the paintings were considered Ferdinand's property and not Adela's property. So the circumstance was that in her will, she asked her husband to do something with his property after he died. And so that's how things stood in 1925-26. Ferdinand set up the Klimt paintings, Maria said, in a room in their home, sort of a memorial to Adela. She said there were always fresh flowers on the table in the middle. And Maria said she and her older siblings and parents would go there at least once a week on the weekends to spend time with their uncle Ferdinand, who was a widower at that time. Here is the Austrian Gallery, Belvedere, the museum that Adela was talking about. It was made from one of the old Habsburg palaces, the Summer Palace. in Vienna. If you've been there, you've probably been to the Belvedere. It's one of the most famous museums in Vienna, and it was established after World War I as a home for Austrian art. Ferdinand became the president of the Friends of the Museum. Again, Adela and Ferdinand were big supporters of these new public buildings and enterprises after World War I. He even purchased another painting, a seventh painting by Klimt. This is the unfinished portrait of their friend Amalia Zurkerkandel, who, along with her daughter, was sent to Belzec and murdered. You may have read last week there was a painting in France at the Musée d'Orsay that was returned to this family. This painting, unfortunately, remains on display in the Austrian gallery, even though it's very clear to me, at least, that it should be returned to the Bloch-Bauer family. It was still in Ferdinand's home in 1939. But that's a side story we probably won't have time to get into. Ferdinand donated this landscape to the museum in 1936. Again, he was president of the Friends and they needed a good Klimt landscape, so he donated this, of course, before he died. And that left him with 6 Klimt paintings at the time of the Anschluss, not the same 6 that Adela mentioned in her will, just to make things a little confusing, but he still had 6 paintings. So let's go back to Maria, I think, yes. So Maria was born in 1916. She married in 1937, at the end of 37. She called it the last great Jewish wedding in Vienna, a combination of 2 very successful families. Her husband, Fritz, was a little bit older than she was, but was the very much younger brother of a man named Bernard Altman, who was a very, very successful sweater manufacturer. He had a textile company with customers all over Europe, who also amassed a very large art collection. Anyway, Fritz and Maria were married in 1937, and they went on their honeymoon to the Italian Alps. You can see them there. Maria returned home to Vienna, into their new home, and in February of 1938, she turned 22 years old. And in March of 1938, so just a couple weeks later, the Nazis invaded, of course, Austria and the famous Anschluss, where they annexed all of Austria. And for one day to the next, Maria went from on top of the world to the very bottom as the circumstance of Jews in Austria became really impossible almost overnight. So what happened to her family? Fritz's older brother, Bernard, who I just mentioned, fled immediately ahead of the Anschluss, and he was sort of a business genius, I have to say. There's some people who are like this. You could put them on a deserted island on Friday, and by Monday they would be millionaires. That's Bernard Altman. He was a real wheeler dealer, is what we say in the United States. But he fled the Nazis. His house was taken over. All of his property was auctioned off within weeks. But what he did was he contacted all of his customers and said, don't send any money to Vienna, I'll come and pick it up. And so he went to Budapest and Rome and Paris and London and collected the money, and then went to the British and said, I'd like to start up a new company in England. And they welcomed him in, and he was immediately able to set up a new sweater company in Liverpool, England. Well, the Nazis were not very happy about this. Of course, they took over his company in Vienna, and they accused him of stealing from his own company after they had taken it from him. And in retaliation for that, they arrested his younger brother, Fritz. So the Gestapo came and took Fritz, and he actually went to Dachau and spent several months there. If you saw the movie Woman in Gold, you didn't see any of this because the filmmaker said it would have been a movie in and of itself, what happened with Fritz. So he was in Dachau over the summer until his older brother Bernard was able miraculously to raise enough money to pay a ransom and get him out of Dachau. So he actually sent money back to Germany, and the Nazis released Fritz from Dachau back to Vienna, where he was still under sort of house arrest. But very much, if you saw the movie, it was very similar to what happened. Maria and Fritz made a fake appointment at the dentist and escaped out the back, and were able to fly then to Cologne, where they met someone who helped them cross the border into Holland. At that time, of course, the Dutch were returning Jews back to Germany. They would be considered illegal aliens, right, without permission to come in. So they had to find someone to sneak them over the border. They found there was a priest who was helping Jews escape into Holland at that time. This is around October 1938. And they were able to escape to safety in Holland. The priest was captured several months later by the Nazis and executed for that. So it was a very dangerous operation. But Bernhard Altman met Fritz and Maria in Holland and quickly flew them to safety in England, where they stayed for a little bit before moving to the United States and settling in Fall River, Massachusetts, where Bernhard was setting up yet another company so quickly. They had their first child in 1940 in Fall River, Massachusetts. And then when the war started at the end of 1941, Fritz wanted to help the war effort. And so they moved to Los Angeles, where Fritz was able to get a job working for one of the aerospace companies helping in the war effort. And that's when they reconnected with their friends from Vienna, my mother's parents, Erich and Trude Zeisel, who had also escaped the day after Kristallnacht from Vienna, first to Paris, then New York, and then Los Angeles. So that's how the families came together. And Maria and Fritz became really the closest friends of my grandparents. They were at every family event and celebration. My mother, as an only child, grew up with the 4 Altman kids as her sort of half siblings. And the families were just very close, which is why so many years later I became involved. So what about the Klimt paintings and the rest of Maria's family? Maria's father unfortunately died that summer, unlike what you see in the film. But her mother was able to escape along with her older brothers. Her sister Louisa was married to a Baron Gutmann who owned a lumber estate in Croatia, then Yugoslavia. So they escaped first to Yugoslavia thinking that that would be safe, but then when the Nazi allied U.S.A. took over Yugoslavia, and all the Jews were deported then to Jasenovac and were murdered in Auschwitz, Maria's sister Louisa and her husband and their 2 children were able to hide. They had a friend who hid them through the war, and they survived until the end of the war. Very few Jews survived in that area, but they survived and came out of hiding. And once they came out of hiding, the communists then arrested Maria's brother-in-law, Louisa's husband, and accused him of being a capitalist criminal. And he was sentenced in a show trial to execution, was executed. So he managed as a Jew to survive the entire Nazi period, only to come out and be executed by the communists. Louisa then fled from Yugoslavia with her 2 children to Palestine. This was right before the War of Independence. She was there in Israel during the War of Independence, and then left shortly afterwards to join her 3 brothers who had made their way to Vancouver, Canada, in British Columbia on the west coast of Canada. So at the end, Maria and her siblings were all on the west coast. Maria in Los Angeles, and the rest of the siblings and her mother all the way up in Vancouver, Canada. What happened to Ferdinand and the paintings? That comes next. So let's see, we have this. Ferdinand, like Maria's brother-in-law, Bernhard Altman, was very prominent, knew he was going to be a target of the Nazis, and managed to escape just as the Anschluss was happening over the border, first to Czechoslovakia, where he owned his estate, but the Nazis, as you know, took over the Sudetenland in October of 1938, and then annexed all of Czechoslovakia in March of 1939, so just 1 year later. And by that time, he escaped to Zurich, Switzerland, where he had some friends who put him up in a hotel in Zurich. And he lived there through the end of the war. While we were going through this, people said, oh, he was living fine in a hotel in Zurich. Of course, during World War II, there wasn't a lot of tourism in Switzerland, and so the hotels were completely empty. Ferdinand had no money at all. And when he died just shortly after the war ended in November 1945, he had nothing, not a penny to his name. But he did leave behind a short will that made his heirs his 2 nieces and one of his nephews, and their hope was to recover the property. So what happened to Ferdinand's property? Obviously, the sugar company was taken away, and all the homes were taken away. But what about his artwork? So here you see a document from 1939, from January 1939. There was a Nazi lawyer named Dr. Erich Führer. His name was really Führer, who was a very big Nazi, and he became head of the lawyers chamber, for example, in Austria. And he was appointed to represent Ferdinand's estate and basically liquidate it to pay off taxes that were assessed against Ferdinand by the Nazis. So he held a meeting in January in Ferdinand's home, and this is the minutes of that meeting. And at the meeting, there were a number of people invited, representatives of the other local museums in Vienna, but also a representative of Hitler. Hitler, as you may know, tried to study art as a young man in Vienna and unfortunately was rejected from the academy. As Maria liked to say, if only they had let him in and let him be a painter, the whole world would have been a much better place. But he fancied himself somewhat of an art connoisseur, and so when he amassed all of his money from the sales of Mein Kampf and becoming chancellor and all of the things that he was able to do, he exercised what they called the right of first refusal. Wherever the Nazis went, when they confiscated Jewish art collections, he was able to purchase first. So he had a representative, the representatives of the tax authorities and of the Gestapo there. And they essentially divided up Ferdinand's artworks. And you can see them all listed. The Klimt paintings are listed first on this list. Hitler, by the way, didn't like Klimt. It was a little too modern for him. So he took this Waldmüller painting of Count Esterhazy with a white rabbit. That was his style. And these paintings that Hitler took were planned to be used for a big museum he was building in his hometown of Linz, Austria, which was going to be known as the Führer Museum. So he was collecting artworks from all over Europe that he was setting up to build there. Of course, that didn't get finished before the Nazis fell. And these paintings, including this Waldmüller painting, were then found by American soldiers in the salt mines around Austria, where the art collections of Hitler and Goering were stored at the end of the war. And they were recovered and sent to what's called the Munich Art Collecting Point that the Allies set up in Munich. And the procedure there was to send, you couldn't just go to Munich if you were a family and pick up paintings. You had to ask your home country to ask the Allies to return the painting to the home country, and then you had to get it back from the home country. So we're going to talk a little bit later about how that influenced what happened to the Klimt paintings, but that was the procedure. And if you saw the movie The Monuments Men with George Clooney, it's all about this American troop of soldiers who went around rescuing paintings like this. So what happened to the Klimt paintings? It's a little bit complicated, so everybody hold on. Dr. Führer had these paintings, right, and needed to liquidate them. So what did he do? He made a deal with the Austrian Gallery, the museum, and he traded the Austrian Gallery the gold portrait of Adela and the apple trees, so 2 paintings. And in return, he got back the Schlosskammer am Attersee picture. This is the one that Ferdinand had already donated in 1936. So it was a 2-for-1 trade. And perhaps this one was easier to sell. So he sold it, he flipped it and sold it to a guy named Gustav Uschitsky. So who is Gustav Uschitsky? Gustav Uschitsky is a Nazi film director, very, very famous at that time. His most successful film was called Heimkehr, or Returning Home, about the invasion of Poland, just to give you an idea. So he made these Nazi propaganda films, was fabulously successful, and used the money that he made to buy paintings by his father, Gustav Klimt. He's one of those 18 illegitimate children of Gustav Klimt. So Gustav Uschitsky buys the Schlosskammer am Attersee picture, while the 2 other paintings end up at the Austrian Gallery. The Austrian Gallery then purchases from the estate the 2nd portrait of Adela. So at the end of the day, the museum had the 2 portraits and the 1 landscape, the apple tree. The beechwood or birch trees was sold to another museum in Vienna called the City Museum of Vienna. And Dr. Führer, the lawyer, the Nazi lawyer, kept the 6th painting, this Houses on Unterweg am Attersee, for himself, along with 11 other paintings in the collection, to pay himself for a job well done. There's a whole long correspondence about that. So at the end of the day, again, there are 3 paintings in the Austrian Gallery, 1 in the City Museum, 1 that Dr. Führer has, and then the one that Ferdinand donated was with Gustav Uschitsky, and that the 7th painting that Ferdinand had a completely different story. No one is quite clear how, but it somehow left the bedroom of Ferdinand, where it was, at least until 1939, was sold by the son-in-law of the woman in the painting to an art dealer whose husband then bought it, and then she later donated it to the museum, which is where it hangs today. Okay, so as I mentioned, Ferdinand died shortly after the end of the war in 1945 in November. At the time I learned about this, I thought, well, why didn't he go back to Vienna, right? The war had ended in May. Why couldn't he just go back and collect his property? And it turns out that civilians were not allowed to return to Austria until the end of 1946 or into 1947. Austria was really in ruins at the end of World War II, and it was occupied by the Americans and British and French and Russians. So civilians like Ferdinand were not allowed to go back. And so he died before even having a chance to come back and recover any of his property. And so it was left to his two nieces and one nephew to try to recover things. So Maria's older brother, Robert, was the lead person. He was the oldest sibling. And he hired a friend of his named Gustav Klimt. Sorry, everybody in the story is named Gustav. There's nothing I can do about it. Dr. Gustav Klimt was a family friend, lawyer in Vienna, and his job was then to try to recover as much property as he could that Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer had owned. And so there was, of course, the house, right? That's easy to find, and the sugar company, but the painting's not so easy to find. And it took until 1947 for him to locate some of the paintings. He wrote at the end of 1947 to the Austrian gallery and said, I understand you may have some paintings from the collection of Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer, and what is your position with regard to my client's claims for restitution? Before I go on, let me explain that the restitution laws in Austria did not go into effect until 1948. So the entire Nazi period is 38 to 45, 7 years, and it's another 3 years before the Allies force Austria to pass laws allowing Jewish families, whoever had survived or escaped, to come back and recover their property. So this is just at the beginning of that period. And the Austrian gallery in January of 1948 wrote back to Dr. Klimt and said, restitution claims? What restitution claims? We own the Klimt paintings. They were given to us by the will of Adela Bloch-Bauer when she died in 1925. And Ferdinand, her husband, was just allowed to keep them during his lifetime. But we own the paintings. And as a matter of fact, we only have 3 of them. We're supposed to have 6. So you better find the other 3 and give them to us, or we're going to sue you. And they actually prepared to file a lawsuit against the heirs over the other 3 paintings. So this was the spring of 1948. Remember, the restitution laws are just coming into effect. And Dr. Klimt had, by that time, recovered the paintings that Dr. Führer had taken, those 12. He had discovered that there were paintings at the Munich art collecting point, like that Prince Esterhazy, or Count Esterhazy and the Rabbit. And he learned also that what the Austrians were doing at that time was they were using an older law to try to extort donations from Jewish families. And so what were they doing? They had a law that said you could not export artwork from Austria without permission from the government. And what they were routinely doing is denying permission for Jewish families, whoever managed to escape to United States or Canada, Australia, England, Palestine, right? And had come back and tried to recover things, whoever wanted to bring them to their new home, because most Jews did not want to return and live in Austria. They had to go through this procedure of seeking export permits. And the export permits were denied. And if you appealed the denial of the export permit, then the Austrian government would say, well, if you donated some of the paintings to our federal museums, we might let you take some of the others out. And through this procedure, they extorted donations, in quotes, from the Austrian Rothschild family. Many of the prominent Jewish families had to donate dozens, sometimes hundreds of artworks to Austrian museums after World War II in order to retrieve some of their property from Austria. So Dr. Klimt, knowing this, had a meeting then in April of 1948. He had not yet seen the will of Adela Bloch-Bauer because the Austrian gallery had taken the court file. And we know about this meeting because he wrote to Maria's brother the day after, on April 11th, 1948. And he said, I had this meeting with the authorities from the museum and the monument agency that governs export permits. And I looked at the will for the first time, and it might not be exactly binding, but then there's this promise from Ferdinand. And so I made a decision. I told them that we would not fight over the Klimt paintings. We would let them stay in the Austrian gallery. But through that, I hope to get permission to export all of the other artworks that I've collected, all the Waldmüllers, the old Austrian Biedermeier paintings. And that deal largely worked. They were able to export to Canada and Los Angeles. Maria had one in her home. Some of these other paintings, but the Klimt paintings stayed. They also had to donate some of the porcelain collection that had been taken by one of the museums. Some Klimt drawings had to be donated, but they were successful in getting quite a lot of other property out of Austria through that procedure. And that's really where things stood for about 50 years until 1998. If you had asked Maria during this time period, remember she was still the baby of the family. She had young children, and really her older brother, I think, handled most everything. She would have told you that it's too bad her Aunt Adela gave these Klimt paintings to the museum and they never got them back after the war, but they got all this other property. And that's really what she thought until 1998. And what happened was there was an exhibit in New York of paintings by Egon Schiele, another artist, Austrian artist, who also died in the flu epidemic in 1918. And they were alleged to have been Nazi-looted paintings that had not been returned. And they were seized by the district attorney in New York, which led to, I think, 14 years of litigation. But what happened was in Austria, there was a big outcry. The government minister for education and culture said, this is ridiculous. We don't have any looted artworks in Austria. Everything was returned after the war. And there was a journalist named, I have a picture of him here, Hubertus Czernin, who was a terrific journalist. And he decided to test this, what the minister was saying, and looked in the archives to find out how all of these paintings that had been owned by Jewish families, like the Bloch-Bauers, like the Rothschilds, or the Laters, how they had ended up in Austrian museums. And what he discovered was this extortion procedure after the war, that the Austrian government had forced these families to donate these pictures to the museum in exchange for export permits. Hubertus Czernin, I should add, is famous in Austria for two other things. One is he reported on the first priest sex abuse case in Austria long before that was popular. And he also was the one who uncovered the Nazi past of Kurt Waldheim, who had been in the Wehrmacht and had become General Secretary of the United Nations, but no one had disclosed that fact until Hubertus interviewed him and got permission to look at his file and disclosed all of these things. So he's really an amazing journalist, unfortunately died very young of a terrible disease. But as a result of his reporting on this situation with the artworks, the Austrian government proposed a new law in 1998 in September, October, which was designed to return artworks that had been donated in exchange for export permits after the war. And this is when Maria called me. She called me in September 1998 because she had heard about this new law, and I had read about it also in the Austrian newspapers, which were online. It's hard to imagine these days, but that was a very new thing to be able to look at the news on a computer, but I had just happened to look at it because my parents were in Vienna at that time. And so when Maria called me, I knew what she was talking about. I, of course, had seen the painting of Adela Bloch-Bauer when my parents had taken me as a kid to Austria. I remember my mom saying, that's, you know, your grandmother's friend Maria, that's her aunt Adela Bloch-Bauer. So I knew it was a portrait of her aunt, but I didn't even know that the family had owned it. So I didn't know anything about the story until Maria told me. And her sister had died 6 months earlier, and she had inherited all of the documentary evidence, and she gave it to me, and it painted, I thought, a pretty compelling picture. And so I asked my big law firm if they would let me help out my grandmother's friend, and they said, okay, you know, you can sort of do it on the side. So I helped her initially, and we tried to navigate through this new law. And the law did not give anybody a right to do anything. They basically just set up a commission in Austria that was going to decide what to return and what not to return. And I think the way the Austrians looked at it was that they didn't need to talk to anybody, that they knew everything about every painting. And so there was no procedure that we could participate in. I wrote them a letter and said, we have lots of documents, would you like to see them? And got no response, right? They just were not interested in, so I sent the documents anyway, because I knew that they were important, these lawyer letters from Maria's lawyer, Dr. Reinisch. But we waited, and I offered to go to Austria and speak to their commission, and they said, no, we're not allowed to do that. We're not allowed to speak to unrelated parties. Maria was considered sort of an outside party. They were going to do this all internally. And so, not surprisingly, with this really bad procedure, in June of 1999, they made a decision, and they decided they were returning some of the porcelain and drawings to the Bloch-Bauers, but the Klimt paintings they refused to return. And the excuse they gave was that they had that these paintings had been given to the museum by Adela in her will, and therefore this was not a case of restitution. So I discussed it with Maria, and I said, listen, I don't think that's right. First of all, Maria's father had said that that wasn't correct. Dr. Reinisch also hinted at it in 1948 when he made this deal. And I said, listen, I think under the law, this is not a binding will, and it doesn't really give them the right to the paintings. Essentially, they got the paintings when Dr. Reinisch made that exchange for getting export permits for other works out of the country. So what do you do when that happens? I said to Maria, I said, we should look and see if maybe there's a way to file a lawsuit in Austria, even though the law didn't really give that right. And I found a lawyer who said, well, we could do a type of lawsuit, sort of a declaratory relief lawsuit about the will. But the problem is that in Austria, to file a lawsuit, you have to pay, you have to deposit with the court a fund that is sufficient to pay the other side's attorney's fees. And it's calculated as a percentage of the value at stake in the litigation. So because the paintings were so valuable, Maria Altman would have had to pay, she and the other heirs would have had to pay about $2 million just to start a very risky lawsuit in Austria. So she was already in her mid 80s at that time, and we said, that's not going to be possible. So we tried to actually get that amount reduced in Austria, but the Austrian court said, well, she doesn't have to pay more than everything she owns. She just has to pay everything she owns. So all of her property, all of her savings, other than her house, would have had to have been filed and paid to a court to start the lawsuit. So this was not possible for someone who was 83 or 84 years old at the time. And so I very naively, I was much younger then, this is now in 2000, 1999, 2000, I looked at the possibility that Maria could sue in Los Angeles, because after all, she had been an American citizen since the mid 40s, even before this deal was made in 1948, and she lived in Los Angeles, so why couldn't she sue? And so I looked in the law, and there's something in the US law called the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act of 1976, the year 1976. And you can tell by the title that the general rule is that foreign states are immune. You cannot sue a foreign state in the US court. And remember, these paintings were owned by Austria, by the government of Austria. But there was an exception, which had not been used very much. And the exception was in a case concerning property taken in violation of international law, where the property is owned or operated by an agency or instrumentality of a foreign state that is engaged in a commercial activity, then you can sue. So I said, well, the paintings were taken by the Nazis. That should be in violation of international law. They're owned or operated by this museum, which is an agency or instrumentality of the Republic of Austria. All I need to do is find some commercial activity that they're engaged in the United States, and we can sue. And I found that they had published a book in the United States with Yale University Press. They had advertised in the United States. They accepted US credit cards. I thought there was enough of a nexus, enough of a connection that I could sue, file a lawsuit for Maria in the United States. And my firm was unfortunately not interested in doing this. They thought it was a little bit crazy and impossible. And so shortly before our second child was born, I decided to leave my firm. I'd been there 3 years, and I went out on my own, opened up my own office. And one of the first things I did was I filed a lawsuit against Austria on behalf of Maria Altman. And everybody thought I was crazy, and it was a little bit crazy. I was not overly convinced that we were going to win, but I thought at least this way we keep the case alive, and it's a political case, and really anything can happen if we keep the issue alive. So Austria then hired a law firm to represent them, a nice Jewish law firm called Proskauer Rose, a famously Jewish firm out of New York. And they did what any lawyer would do. They filed a motion to dismiss the case on a whole number of grounds, all of which were denied by the judge. And that was a big surprise to everybody that we had made it over that hurdle. But one of the issues had to do with this sovereign immunity question. And in general, a party cannot appeal a lower court motion until the case is over. But when it concerns sovereign immunity, you get an immediate right to appeal. So Austria appealed to what's called the Ninth Circuit in California. It's a federal circuit court that covers the whole West Coast. And I argued for the first time for me in the Ninth Circuit in front of 3 judges. And really no one on earth thought we had a chance of winning, but miraculously all 3 judges agreed with our position and affirmed the district court. So I was feeling pretty good about the case. At that time, it was 2002, been going on for about 4 years. But then something happened. The US government decided to get involved. Apparently at the State Department in the United States, they were not very excited about the decision that had come down and thought it might be used against other countries. And they were worried that would interfere with our foreign relations. And so the US government filed a brief in the Ninth Circuit asking the Ninth Circuit to change its decision, to review it with a full court and change it, which fortunately the Ninth Circuit did not do. So the case became final in the Ninth Circuit, and then Austria petitioned the US Supreme Court to take the case. So when you have a foreign country asking the Supreme Court to review a case and the US government is on the side of the foreign country, it makes it more likely that the case is going to be considered. They don't take a lot of cases, but they did. And so again, everybody was certain that we were going to lose, and I was also not optimistic at all, because in general, the Ninth Circuit, where in California, got reversed almost every time by the Supreme Court when they took a case. So everybody expected that this was going to be like that. And my hope when I went to Washington, I think I have a picture here, was that at least one judge, maybe Justice Ginsburg, right, would be the one who would say that I was right, or at least had a reasonable argument, even if we lost. And so I went to argue, and I had, again, not high expectations. But what happened was that the other side went first, the Austria's lawyer and the US government lawyer, and they were getting difficult questions. And so I was feeling pretty good when I got up to speak. And you don't give a speech in the Supreme Court, they interrupt you with questions all the time. And so I started out by saying there are 4 grounds for affirming the Ninth Circuit. Ground 1 is, and I finished one sentence. There's a recording of this, so you could listen to it. I can't lie about it. I finished one sentence and was immediately interrupted by one of the justices, Justice Souter, who was from New Hampshire. Very smart guy. And he started asking me this question. And it was a long, convoluted question. And at the end of it, I had no idea what he had just said. I did not understand what he was talking about. And you can hear on the tape, I say, I didn't know what to say. And finally I said, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I don't think I understood the question. Could you please rephrase it? And you can hear gasps in the audience, but all the other justices smiled as if to say, oh, thank goodness you asked. We didn't understand it either. It made no sense what he had just asked. And it was the right answer was, what do you mean? It didn't make any sense. So he rephrased it. I sort of understood what he was getting at. And by accident, I had established credibility, right? I had just at the first question established my credibility, because what was I? I was just a kid from Los Angeles representing my grandmother's friend in this crazy case. I wasn't going to pretend that I was the world's expert on sovereign immunity, or the issue in the case was whether it was impermissibly retroactive to apply the law that was passed in 1976 to a case that concerned events in 1938 and 48, right? So I was not the world's expert. I wasn't going to pretend, and it became just a conversation with the justices. It was terrific. And I just floated out of the courtroom. I was so happy. And my dad, who was a retired judge, was, for the first time, he said, wow, that went really well. You know, you might even have a chance of winning. So excited. And Maria and I celebrated. And I came home to Los Angeles, and there's a legal newspaper. And I opened the legal newspaper reporting on the case, and it said, court likely to reverse Altman case. It was all about how we were going to lose. So I called up the journalist. I said, you know, at least you could have said, Randy did a good job, but court likely, right, to reverse. But it was all negative. And I said, why do you say that? It seemed to go so well. And he said, no, I've been reporting on the Supreme Court for 34 years. Trust me, I could tell you don't stand a chance. So I said, okay, that's what we expected anyway. Sort of sad, but do me a favor, call me when you find out the decision, because they don't tell you they're going to decide the case. They just sort of release the opinion. So the only people who find out are these journalists. So sure enough, 3 months later, I'm in Los Angeles. It's early in the morning, and I'm making breakfast, and this phone rings, and it's this journalist, and he says, "This is Dave Pike," very serious voice. I said, "Okay, give me the bad news, right?" And he said, "No, not bad news. You won. 6-3 decision. Justice Stevens wrote the opinion." I must have dropped the phone because I don't remember anything else. I hurried and got ready and rushed over to Maria's house, and her kids came over, and we all celebrated, and oh, it was so great. And then after a little bit, we realized, what did we just win, right? We won the right to start the case. We were at step one, so we had won nothing. And it was already 6 years into this whole ordeal. So we then returned down to the district court and did sort of ordinary things in court for about 1.5 years, until finally we had a court-ordered mediation where the parties come together and try to resolve things. Now, up to this point, the Austrians had refused to talk to us at all about anything. So I did not think this mediation would go anywhere, but they immediately suggested that we take the case out of the US courts and do an arbitration in Austria with 3 Austrian judges. So I pulled Maria aside into another room, and I said, isn't this great? We could do this arbitration, and the case would be over, and we would get the paintings, and it's so wonderful. And she said, are you crazy? Why would I want my case decided in Austria? The US Supreme Court loves us. All the judges love us here. Why would we risk that and go back to Austria? And I said to her, you know, Maria, you're 89 years old. This case has a lot still to go. There are a lot of different legal hurdles. It could go back up to the US Supreme Court again, even on some of them. And if you want the case decided in your lifetime, I think we have to take the chance. And fortunately, she stuck with me, and I went back to Austria, and I did this arbitration. And it was not like in the movie with lots of people. It was just the arbitrators, the judges, and a few lawyers. And it was very difficult. It was in German, which fortunately I can do a little bit, but I had a translator just in case. And we waited about 4 months for the decision, which was very difficult. There were a lot of rumors in Austria that we had lost. And finally, I was returning home from a poker game in my neighborhood, a little dejected because I had lost a little money, and it was a Sunday night. And sure enough, on my BlackBerry phone, there was an email from the judges in Austria. It was already Monday morning there. And so I raced to the computer and opened it up, and sure enough, we had won. We won the case. All 3 arbitrators agreed with our position, which was Maria's father's position back in 1926, which was that the will was precatory. It was not binding on Ferdinand. Ferdinand owned the paintings. He was not obligated to give them to the museum. They were stolen from him by the Nazis before he had a chance to do that. And in his will, he gave everything to his nieces and nephews. So they essentially donated these paintings in 1948 in exchange for export permits for other paintings. And therefore, under Austria's new law, they had to be returned. And so then we really celebrated. But of course, we weren't done yet. The paintings were still in Austria. So what do you do when you suddenly recover 5 incredibly valuable paintings? And I contacted our local museum, the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, curator Stephanie Barron, who I knew there. And I said, how'd you like to have a Klimt exhibit? And she said, when? I said, as soon as you can. And she said, great. And we got the paintings out very quickly. So they were put on display then in April of 2006. And for me, this was really the best moment in the whole thing after 8 years, to have Maria there in front of the paintings, just like when she was growing up as a kid. The paintings were all in one room, and she had her family, all her kids and grandkids and nieces and nephews. Everybody was there. She was the last of her generation. And it was really sort of a triumphant conclusion to the case. The paintings then went on to New York, to the Neue Gallery on 86th and 5th in New York that Ronald Lauder had set up. And you can see in these two pictures, there were two statues that in 2007, the Austrian Gallery realized these also had belonged to Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer. And they realized that after finding a picture from Mannheim, the first exhibit of the gold portrait in 1907 had these two statues. And so that helped them identify these as the two statues owned by Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer. And so they were returned to the family, and the family donated them to the Neue Gallery. So you could see them on display the same way that they were at their very first exhibit there. The rest of the paintings went up for auction then at the end of the year, so that the proceeds could be divided up among all of the heirs. And I was compensated as well, which no one had ever expected in the beginning of it. At the conclusion of these, and this is an audience that I don't have to remind, but I give a lot of these talks, and I always remind people that, of course, in the scheme of things, stealing art was not among the major crimes of the Nazis. There were a lot worse things that happened to all of our families, including my own, including Maria's. I think, I'm not sure I mentioned yet, my great-grandfather was sent to Theresienstadt in July of 1942 and deported then to Treblinka in September. Maria's aunt, so Ferdinand and Gustav's older sister, Agnes, lived in Prague. She was 89 years old. She was deported to Theresienstadt. I just looked it up today. I think July 13th, 42. I think my great-grandfather got there from Vienna July 14th, so almost the same day. She only lasted 3 days. She died of a heart attack 3 days after arrival in Theresienstadt. So I don't have to tell this audience, there were a lot worse things that happened during World War II, and of course, a lot more important things to worry about after the war than artworks. So many lives have been destroyed. And so I think it's not surprising that the post-war restitution process was not perfect, and that there were artworks that didn't get returned. And nevertheless, it's really been an unbelievable pleasure for me to have been able, so many years later, to help someone like Maria Altman recover these artworks, because my family background is essentially the same. So thank you very much for listening and for supporting Beit Theresienstadt, Beit Terezin in Israel. I really, as I said, I've been a long-time supporter of Beit Terezin, and really commend it on the mission that it has. And I hope everybody listening here will also become a supporter. I'm very happy to take any questions. I know it was a long talk, and I couldn't see all of you while I was doing it. So I can open up now and maybe get a better view of everybody. Look at everybody there. I think I saw before we started some familiar names, like Anita Tarsi, who I think was running Beit Terezin when I first became involved in it, or Eleanor Feitler, who was married to a cousin of mine, I think was on the call. So I see a lot of familiar names. We're all really one big happy family here, and I'm very happy to take any questions from any of you, or just to say hi. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Randy. It was a fascinating talk and very inspiring. There are some questions here I see about recording. Yes, the talk was recorded, and it will be on Beit Terezin website, so you can look it over in a few days. Well, there are many thanks here. If somebody has a question, you can write it in the chat, and Randy will answer. Okay, so if there are no more questions.
Michaela Vidlakova is raising her hand. Do you want to unmute her, or?
Yeah.
How do we do that? Are you going to be in charge, or should I?
Yeah. Noah, can you unmute?
Okay. Hi, Tommy.
Hello.
Hello. I
Hi.
have two questions.
Yes.
Just to introduce myself, I'm a survivor of Terezin and I live in Prague. And two questions. One is, I'm not a lawyer, but I looked at the last will and I didn't see a signature of Adela made by her own hand. Was it there? I looked at the...
Let me, I guess I can unshare. Should I stop sharing? I'm trying to figure out how to do that so everybody can see things. Sorry, there we go. There we go. I only have 2 of the 4 pages of the will. If you'd like to see the other 2 pages have her signature. So it's definitely her last will. This was the will that was put into what we call in America probate. So it was filed with the court. And so there's no dispute that that's her will, but I could only, graphically, it was easier. If I showed all 4 pages, you wouldn't have been able to read any of them, but at least this way.
This is the explanation I understand.
Yes.
And the other question is, did you try to restore also the real estate, for example?
That's a great question. You're in Prague. You could drive, I think it's what, 15, 20 minutes up to Odolena Voda, and you pass by the place where Heydrich was assassinated, I think, right? North of Prague, if I know the geography. That castle was never returned.
No.
In this group, I think we can talk about it. And you lived through it, so you can tell us more, I'm sure. But the property in Bohemia that Ferdinand owned, there was no opportunity to recover it since he was dead. Up through 1948, 49, and then the communists took over, right? And then there was really no opportunity to recover things. When Václav Havel and the revolution came, there was talk of restitution laws, but 2 things happened. One is that when the Czechoslovakia at that time, it was combined, passed its restitution law after the end of communism, they made it so only the original owner and children, I think, could make a claim for property, not a niece or an heir by will like Maria Altman. So that was one issue. But the bigger issue was that they very, I think, underhandedly privatized the castle. So the castle had been taken over by the communists and was state property in Czechoslovakia. And before they enacted restitution laws, they sold off the castle to a private entity so it wouldn't have to be returned, which I'm sure happened with a lot of properties owned by the government in Czechoslovakia during that early post-communist era. So that the castle is in private hands. Occasionally it gets in the news. At one point, one of Heydrich's kids, I think, wanted to go back and restore it because he had grown up there. And that got a lot of press and everybody said, ridiculous, and so he went away. But I think if you go up there, it's vacant and a ruin basically, because no one wants to touch it. I think it's if you want to do something about it, I'm more than happy to work with you. I think it's a huge scandal that the home taken for Reinhard Heydrich from a Jewish family, right, has not been returned to that family. And if the law doesn't allow it to be returned, then the law needs to be changed. And it's just a scandal, I think. It's an incredible scandal for the Czech government. As much as I love everybody when I go to Prague, and I love being there, and I love the food, and everybody's so nice, politics in all of our countries is not always perfect, and it's certainly not perfect there. So restitution has been impossible up to this point. And,
I think it's now, by this time, it's already too late to restitute it, but
it's never too late.
It would have been interesting to get it back.
Yeah,
Randy, there are 2 more questions.
Yes, all the artworks, by the way, taken from the castle have disappeared, have not been returned and recovered. So anyway, more questions, but I could talk about it forever. It's a tragedy.
What happened to the second picture of Adele? Is one of the questions.
So after the war, all the paintings remained in the Austrian gallery until they were returned to the family. The second portrait was purchased at auction in 2006 by Oprah originally, and it was put on display again several years ago, I think. at the Museum of Modern Art. And then she, I think, sold it to someone in Asia, I think, right now, which almost makes sense since it has these Japanese figurines in the background, or Chinese figurines. So I think that's where it is now. You know, these paintings we're used to seeing them in the public eye because they were part of the museum, but they were private property. They belonged to Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer, who was this incredibly wealthy person. When the heirs recovered them, they were not wealthy people. This was sort of an inheritance to them. And so, so they sold it, and then it was purchased by someone who was like the Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer of today, right? Someone very wealthy with too much money. These paintings get sort of passed around by the billionaire class, and ultimately they all end up in a museum. They get donated eventually, and I'm sure that's what will happen with this. But for the time being, it's still in private hands, so that's where it is. I think one of the landscapes was purchased by Paul Allen, who was with Bill Gates, you know, the founder of Microsoft, who was setting up a museum in Seattle. So it'll probably go on display there. And that's how these things go with these paintings. But in the meantime, we can enjoy reproductions of them, which is nice also. More questions.
Another question is, how did the story make it to Hollywood?
Oh, that's an interesting question. So while it was going on, you know, there was increasing interest in that time period in Nazi looted art, and there was a documentary, and then another documentary, and ultimately, I think 4 or 5 sort of documentary films that either focused on this or touched on it. And so I knew there was a lot of interest in this. I mean, it's a great story, obviously, had everything. And I even put together sort of I'm not a Hollywood person, even though I live in Los Angeles. I put together all the articles that had been written in English and sort of made like a scenario or a treatment type thing, just because so many people were asking. And I'd say, okay, here's the package. If you want to do something, let me know. And I talked to a number of you know, important people, but nothing ever came of it until one of the documentaries that was made in England was shown on the BBC, and the director, Simon Curtis, saw it on the BBC and contacted a producer at BBC Films and said, I think we should pursue this story and make it into a film. I'd like to make it into a film. And so they approached me. Maria was still alive. It was right at the end of her life. Approached the two of us and said they wanted to buy the rights to make the film. So they bought what's called our life rights, which is basically they can do whatever they want with us as a character. We were a little apprehensive, but we figured BBC Films sounded like a reputable organization and it would make it into a terrible movie. And so we trusted them and sold our life rights. And so the BBC Films then put together the film. They films like this, it actually happens. I learned a lot, by the way, through the process. It's very common for them to buy stories and then not do anything with them in Hollywood. Sometimes they hire someone to do a script, which is what happened in this case, and then nothing happens. Sometimes it makes it a little bit further. An actor gets interested and still nothing happens. But this one made it all the way through. So they had a script, they passed it around, and Helen Mirren became interested. And once Helen Mirren, who was such a well-known actress, agreed to play the role of Maria, then it really became a possibility, and they could bring in other producers and find financing. They brought in Ryan Reynolds to play me, which was a big surprise. I wasn't that familiar with him, but he looks a little different than I do, put it that way. And I thought it would be some sort of schlubby Jewish guy that they would play me. But anyway, he's a very good looking guy, and they had him play me, which was very flattering. But once they get the actors involved, then they can get the financing, and then they made the film. Now, a lot of films get made and then don't get released because there's no interest in them. But this one did get released and then was very, very popular. It lasted in the theaters in the United States, I think, almost 2 months. And it was really, I think, the most successful, or maybe second most successful, independent film of that year. So it was a very, very, very successful film. And we're very lucky. I was very lucky that way. So it really got the story out, that was sort of the goal that Maria and I had. Remember, when we went to the Supreme Court, we didn't think we were going to win. But I remember saying to Maria, well, at the very least, a lot of people are going to hear your story. A lot of people will know about what happened to you and your family. And that was 90% of our motivation through the whole thing. So to have it turned into a film that was so popular I still get messages. People look me up after seeing the film on TV or renting it on Netflix or Amazon or wherever you rent these things. I still get people writing to me about how inspirational they think the film is. And so I was very, very lucky that that happened.
And the last question, have you been involved in other restitution cases besides Bloch-Bauer?
Yes, I turned off the slideshow, but I have, because of the Bloch-Bauer case, I was sort of introduced to this field and then ended up representing a number of different cases. Maria's brother-in-law, for example, Bernhard Altman, we were able to recover some paintings for that family. There's still quite a few missing important paintings, actually. There was a case involving a Picasso painting, which was also very long and involved, and ultimately very successful. So I was fortunate enough to represent a few other families. And it's in this area, sort of each success leads to new things sometimes. And so it was each time I had success, then other people, other court cases being represented by other people were having success. And so it's a good thing. Recently, there were a couple cases that did not end well, unfortunately. But then again, last week, there's another Klimt painting that got returned. So each time something good happens, it puts wind in the sails, and maybe other good things will happen. I'm still hoping for that Amalia Zuckerkandel painting to be returned. It's really a tragedy that they haven't done it. The problem was that her family had a lawyer who also claimed it should go to them, which made no sense to me and still makes no sense to me since it was in Ferdinand's bedroom in 1939. What else do you need to know, right? Ferdinand's in Switzerland, the painting's in his bedroom in Vienna. What facts could there be that would not lead that painting to get returned to him? Think about it. So that's the problem we have sometimes in these cases, is that unlike this community listening to me now, a lot of people just don't have a feel for what things were like then, and they just can't understand how impossible the situation was for Jews at that time. So they're always looking for proof and evidence, and because literally the decision was because Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer's heirs could not prove what happened to the painting after January 1939 when it was in his house and he was long gone, they couldn't get it back, right? Like it should be their burden to show what the Nazis did with the painting. So that type of thing is very hard for me to take, and I'm sure it would be hard for all of you on this call to take. But that's what happened to this painting. They shifted the burden of proof, and very wrongly, I think. Any other questions? I'm happy to stay on. Someone wants to hear about Czech-Jewish genealogy. I'd love to come back and talk about Czech-Jewish genealogy. As crazy as I am, I'm even more crazy about genealogy. I spent, actually just this last week, I've been working very diligently through something called the Liber Judaeorum Album, which is a book, books that they have in Prague that recorded all of the transactions, a lot of them involving mortgages and loans and things like that, of the Jewish community of Prague, starting in the 1570 period up through around 1800. And you can find just amazing things. Unfortunately, the books are indexed by first name only. So when you're looking for Jacob, you have to see all the I and J are together. So all the Isaacs and Jacobs and Josephs and things that are all like that. So it's very difficult in the handwriting. Michaela Vidlakova could help me probably with the Czech. Handwriting is not so easy for me, and even the German is not so easy for me. So, but I spend a lot of time doing genealogy, and for those of you who are interested, please contact me. I work on a platform called genie.com, where all of us, especially from our community, work together collaboratively like a giant jigsaw puzzle, piecing all of our families back together. We even have a project on Genie for Theresienstadt, where where people who are in the camp who are deceased are able to attach to that project. So we've collected tens of thousands of, identified tens of thousands of people with their families. You know, it's oftentimes the historians just look at the list of names, but don't really have an ability to see what the larger family situation is. And so as genealogists, we try to put that back together. and have been largely successful in that. So if anybody is interested in genealogy, you can certainly contact me, and I'd be very happy to talk to you endlessly about that.
Thank you very much, Randy. And we shall certainly invite you again to talk about genealogy. And for all of you who ask about recording, yes, this talk was recorded, and also other lectures given in this series of lectures of Beit Terezin, and you can find it on our website. And to those of you who are not yet members of Beit Terezin, we invite you to join us and take part in our activities and our commitment to keep the memory of the Holocaust alive. And we will follow up with a more detailed email to those of you who were part of this talk. And you can also register to Beit Terezin via the website that we had published here in the chat. And you can also find us just in the Google, write Beit Terezin or Beit Terezinstadt, and you will find us. So again, I want to thank you very much, Randy, for this fascinating talk and inspiring story. And hope to see you soon again.
Okay, I hope to see everybody live at some point when we get through this whole ordeal. But thank goodness we're all still here. Thank you so much, Tammy.
So good night, everybody, or good day to those of you who are abroad. And see you soon. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.